Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're doing a deep dive today on something that affects all of us in a big way, globalization.
That's right.
And we've got some pretty cool sources to help us out today.
Uh-huh.
They're actually focused on IELTS exam prep.
Oh, cool.
But don't worry if you're not taking the test.
Right.
This stuff is still super relevant, even if you're not prepping for the IELTS.
Yeah.
They give us some great vocabulary and even idioms that can help us really understand all the ins and outs of globalization.
What I think is really interesting about the sources we have is that they actually explore both the advantages of globalization and some of the challenges as well.
Right. So it's not all doom and gloom.
Exactly.
But it's also not, sunshine and rainbows either. How does it really affect us?
Yeah.
What kind of impact does it have on the things we buy and the cultures we experience?
Right.
Even our job opportunities.
Yeah, all of that.
That's what we're going to unpack today.
Okay, so maybe a good place to start is with trade and economies. One of the most significant impacts of globalization is its effect on international trade. It's all about breaking down the barriers like tariffs, those taxes on imported goods
Right.
and quotas, which are limits on how much of something can be imported. So with fewer barriers in place, there's obviously a much smoother flow of goods and services across borders.
Okay. So does this mean everyone is competing on a level playing field now?
Well, not necessarily. While globalization does encourage countries to specialize in what they're best at producing,
Okay.
which is a concept called comparative advantage,
Right.
existing inequalities and historical factors can still kind of give certain countries an edge. Like countries with more advanced technologies and infrastructure often have a head start in certain industries.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
Can you give me an example of what comparative advantage looks like in the real world?
sure. One of the sources actually points out that electronics manufacturing is largely concentrated in Asia because of lower production costs and specialized labor. This obviously benefits consumers all over the world because then we get access to these gadgets, electronics at more affordable prices.
Right.
But it also brings up the concern about potential job displacement in regions where manufacturing just isn't as competitive.
So it's kind of like, every coin has two sides.
Exactly.
Globalization can help boost economies, give us cheaper electronics,
Right.
but also at the same time, it could be disrupting certain industries and impacting jobs.
Yes, absolutely. And this actually leads us to another key area that's affected by globalization, which is consumerism and global markets.
Okay.
Globalization has basically created a massive global marketplace with just tons of products from all over the world.
Okay. I have to admit, I do love having access to stuff from all over the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty amazing.
But what's the real cost of all this convenience? I'm curious.
That's a great question. This easy access to goods definitely leads to lower prices.
Well.
But it also fuels something called a disposable culture. We're constantly seeing new products, and we're encouraged to replace things even before they're actually worn out.
Right.
Think about fast fashion. The trends are constantly changing. Clothes are made really cheaply.
Yeah.
And we're basically encouraged to constantly buy new things.
So, my bargain buy might actually be contributing to some environmental problems?
Potentially, yes.
And maybe even some unfair labor practices. That's a lot to think about.
Absolutely. And this actually brings us to another really fascinating part of globalization, its impact on culture.
Okay.
Globalization leads to what many call a melting pot of cultures. It blends traditions and customs from different parts of the world.
Right.
We get to experience new foods and music and art, and it creates kind of a sense of interconnectedness.
Yeah, I do love trying new foods and different cultures.
Yeah.
But is there a downside to all this cultural exchange?
Well, one potential downside is something called cultural homogenization. And this is where dominant global cultures, which are often driven by big companies and the media, can overshadow or even replace more localized traditions.
Right.
Think about how popular sushi is all over the world.
Okay, yeah.
It's a fantastic example of cultural exchange.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to wonder, if everyone's eating sushi, what happens to all those diverse local cuisines?
Right. It's like some cultures are kind of amplified while others get kind of lost in all the noise.
Exactly.
So how do we ensure that everyone benefits from globalization, especially developing countries?
That is a really complex question.
Yeah.
Globalization can bring job opportunities and foreign investments to those developing regions,
Okay.
but it can also lead to kind of a dependence on those multinational companies.
So it's not as simple as saying globalization is good or bad for a developing country.
No, it's definitely a nuanced issue.
Okay.
One of the sources actually mentions how multinational companies will set up shop in developing regions because of those lower labor costs.
Right.
So this can definitely create jobs, but you also have to think about fair wages and working conditions. There's definitely the potential for exploitation.
Right.
And that means it's crucial to have regulations in place to protect workers.
Okay, so it sounds like globalization is a really powerful force.
Yes, very much so.
It's got both positive and negative aspects.
Lovely.
It can boost economies, connect people across different cultures,
Yeah.
give us access to a wider range of products and services.
Right.
But it also has some serious challenges like job displacement,
Yes.
environmental concerns, and even the potential loss of those unique cultural identities.
Exactly.
That's a lot to consider.
It really is.
It really does sound like we need a thoughtful and balanced approach when we're trying to navigate all the complexities of globalization.
Yeah, absolutely.
So are there ways to mitigate the negative impacts
Yeah, I think so.
and promote a more equitable and sustainable form of globalization?
Yeah, for sure. One key area is promoting fair trade practices.
Okay.
We really need to make sure that workers in developing countries are getting paid fair wages and that they're working in safe conditions.
Right.
This might involve things like establishing international labor standards or monitoring supply chains to prevent exploitation.
So it's not just about the bottom line.
Right.
It's also about making sure that everyone benefits.
Exactly. And another really crucial aspect is environmental sustainability.
Okay.
Globalization has definitely led to more transportation of goods and people,
Right.
and that contributes to carbon emissions and other environmental problems.
Yeah.
So we need to start prioritizing sustainable practices like reducing our carbon footprint,
Okay.
investing in renewable energy sources, protecting biodiversity.
It seems like it's all about striking a balance between economic growth and environmental protection.
Yeah, I think you're right.
We can't just keep consuming the way we are without thinking about those long-term consequences.
Absolutely. One of the sources actually talked about the importance of government policies.
Okay.
Policies that incentivize sustainable practices. Things like offering tax breaks for companies that use renewable energy.
Okay.
Investing in public transportation, those things can make a difference.
Yeah. So it sounds like governments and businesses and individuals all kind of have a role to play.
Definitely.
What about technology?
Yeah.
Could it be a force for good in shaping a more sustainable and equitable form of globalization?
Oh, for sure. Technology can definitely be a part of the solution. One example is blockchain technology.
Okay.
It can be used to create supply chains that are transparent and traceable, which can help to ensure that products are being sourced ethically and workers are treated fairly.
So no more hiding behind those complicated supply chains. That's a huge step towards accountability.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are some other ways that technology can help?
Well, technology can also really help with communication and collaboration across borders. Right. It can connect people from different cultures and help them work together on these global issues. Like, think about online platforms that connect artisans in developing countries with customers around the world.
Yeah.
That really empowers those individuals and allows them to participate in that global marketplace, but on their own terms.
Wow, that's amazing.
Okay.
So technology can really empower individuals, break down barriers, and create those economic opportunities.
Right.
But we have to be mindful of the potential downsides.
Of course. Like anything powerful, technology can be used for good and bad.
Right.
We need to think about the ethics of new technologies and make sure that they're used responsibly and fairly.
It sounds like we really need to be careful and use technology wisely.
Yeah, definitely.
So beyond technology, what are some practical things that individuals can do to promote a more just and sustainable globalization?
Well, I think becoming more conscious consumers is a great place to start.
Yeah.
We can choose to support businesses that prioritize things like fair labor practices and environmental sustainability and ethical sourcing. We can also just consume less in general.
Okay.
Buy less stuff, repair and reuse things whenever we can.
Right.
Choose quality over quantity.
So it's about making sure our spending habits align with our values,
Yeah.
like really putting our money where our mouth is.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of your voice.
Okay.
You can advocate for change by contacting your elected officials,
Right.
supporting organizations that are working on these global issues,
Uh-huh.
and just talking to your friends and family about these things.
So it's about raising awareness, having conversations,
Uh-huh.
using our voices to push for positive change,
Exactly.
and of course staying informed, right?
Yeah.
Educating ourselves about globalization. That's where these IELTS materials come in handy.
Totally.
Not only do they explain these complicated ideas, they also give us the vocabulary and the idioms to really talk about these issues.
Yeah, being able to express ourselves clearly and confidently is so important when you're talking about these complex topics.
Absolutely. Let's recap some of the key terms and phrases we've learned today. We talked about comparative advantage.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, that explains how countries can benefit from specializing in what they produce most efficiently.
Right.
We also talked about globalization being a double-edged sword,
Yeah,
highlighting both its positive and negative impacts.
it's true.
We talked about how globalization creates this melting pot of cultures,
Uh-huh.
but also the potential for cultural homogenization.
Right.
We discussed the importance of fair trade practices,
Absolutely.
environmental sustainability,
Yeah,
and using technology responsibly to create a more just and equitable globalization.
that's right.
These terms are so useful. I really encourage our listeners to use them in their own conversations and share what they've learned with others.
I agree. The more we talk about these issues, the better our chances are of finding solutions.
We've covered a lot of ground today,
Yeah.
from the impact of globalization on trade and economies
Hmm.
to the cultural and environmental implications.
Yeah.
We've looked at some of the challenges, but also the opportunities.
Uh-huh.
But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought-provoking question.
Oh, I like this. Hit me with it.
We've talked about all these forces shaping globalization,
Right.
but what about our own agency? What power do we have as individuals to influence the direction of globalization and create a world where the benefits are more fairly shared?
That's a really powerful question. And I think it's one that each of us needs to really think about.
Yeah, we're not just passive observers. We make choices every day that can impact the world around us.
That's so true. I couldn't have said it better myself. It's been a really fascinating conversation, hasn't it?
It really has.
And something that I think is so important when we're trying to understand globalization is critical thinking.
Oh, absolutely. It's so easy to get caught up in all the hype,
Yeah.
whether it's the good or the bad. But we need to be able to look beyond just the surface. So how can we make sure we're not just kind of passively taking in information,
Yeah.
but really engaging with it in a meaningful way?
Well, one of the most important things we can do is make sure we're looking at lots of different sources of information,
Okay.
not just relying on one news outlet or one social media feed,
Right.
but actually seeking out different perspectives, even ones that challenge our existing beliefs.
Yeah, it's like we need to break free from those echo chambers where everyone just agrees with each other all the time.
Absolutely. And it's also really important to try to be aware of our own biases.
Okay.
We all have our own experiences and values that shape how we see the world.
Right.
And being aware of those biases can help us look at information in a more critical way.
It's like checking our blind spots
Nah.
before we start making judgments about what's going on.
Exactly. And another really important part of critical thinking is asking good questions. So instead of just accepting things at face value, let's dig a little deeper, challenge those assumptions, and look for evidence.
So instead of being told what to think about globalization, we need to become like globalization detectives.
Yeah, I like that.
Do our own research.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to have conversations with people who might have different viewpoints.
Right.
Those kinds of respectful debates and dialogues can really help us refine our own thinking.
Yeah, it's like that old saying, iron sharpens iron.
Uh-huh.
We learn so much from talking to people who have different ideas.
Absolutely.
Speaking of learning, I'm so glad we did this deep dive on globalization today.
Me too.
It's given me a much better understanding of this really complex topic.
Yeah, it's definitely not simple, but it's so important to try to understand it. And remember, this is really just the beginning. There's so much more to explore and learn about globalization, and the impacts are always changing.
So true. So as we wrap up, do you have any final words of wisdom for our listeners?
Just stay curious, keep asking those thought-provoking questions, and never stop learning.
I love that. Well said. A huge thank you to you for guiding us through this deep dive.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our amazing listeners, thank you for joining us on this intellectual adventure. We hope you learned something new and maybe even feel inspired to make a difference in the world.
It was great being here.
Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.